My name is Brian Goll, and I am a current doctoral candidate through Baylor University's online EDD program in Learning and Organizational Change. My advisor and mentor is Dr. Jessica Meehan, and today I invite you to take in my problem of practice with me, the title of which is Deconstructing Feedback, a qualitative case study centered on English teachers' feedback practices and perceived roles in the pursuit of competent expository writing. Let's get started. Although researchers agree that feedback is of fundamental importance and value on students' learning, the reality is that students in our high schools seldom receive adequate writing instruction during their schooling years. And that invites the question of if the writing instruction that they receive is inadequate, then what is the quality of feedback that they received? Well, the reality is that empirical evidence suggesting how teachers provide feedback and how teachers perceive their role in the feedback process is lacking. And here's the issue with that. Without understanding teachers' feedback practices, the likelihood of inadequate writing instruction inevitably increases. And Graham, through his research, found this out. The other problem with this is that if we do not investigate teachers' feedback practices and inadequate writing instruction continues, then the likelihood of insufficient writing skills continuing is inevitable. And insufficient writing skills contribute to fewer job opportunities for students. Graham found this, Graham and Hebert found this, and Sadler and Graham. And so the ability to write coherently and persuasively and argumentatively is of the utmost importance. My literature review focused first on the value of the expository form, the essential skills such as the ability to craft a thesis and topic sentences, the ability to find evidence and to comment on that evidence thoroughly. And it focused also on the instructional challenges, that the expository form is inherently a very strenuous endeavor for teachers because you are teaching the critical thinking skills of developing an argument. But just because it's difficult to do does not mean it's worth pursuing. So how do teachers pursue teaching this expository form through the lens of feedback? Well, feedback has changed over time. It's had many developing definitions and characteristics. One of which is that it used to be solely the product that a teacher produces on a student's paper, meaning the teacher would write copious notes and hope that the student would be able to embrace, unpack, understand, and apply that commentary. The issue with this configuration of feedback is that the teacher was doing the editing and the teacher had accomplished the learning, not the student. And so we flash forward a few years into the evolution of the teacher-student dynamic and feedback. No longer is the teacher seen only as a repository of information and insight, but the teacher attempts to work in collaboration to co-create knowledge through feedback. So in this system, the student and the teacher are co-constructors of knowledge. This requires the teacher have to release some sort of inherent instructional authority and invite the student into that instructional, intellectual space to receive feedback. And this really focused, this approach was the foundation for my theoretical framework. The very last part of my literature review really focused on reconsidering what feedback really looks like, how it's a process driven between two intellects of the teacher and the student, and it's driven through dialogue, not simply the teacher doing the heavy lifting. So the purpose of this qualitative study was to explore and understand secondary English teachers at a private school, how they structure and communicate feedback on expository writing, how these English teachers describe their role, and how these English teachers would describe the perceived improvement that they identified from a student's first draft to their final draft. And as you can see, the three research questions align with the purpose statement. How do they structure and communicate feedback? How would they describe their role in the feedback process? And finally, how would they describe the perceived improvement? The theoretical framework that underpinned this entire study was Careless and Winston's teacher feedback literacy. This positioned the teacher and focus on what the teacher is actively doing. And their theory champions three key dimensions: the design dimension, the relational dimension, and the pragmatic dimension. The design dimension is just that, the design of the teacher's feedback. How exactly does the teacher structure and communicate the feedback to encourage students' learning of that feedback and the use of that feedback? And as you can recall from my research questions, structure and communicate are used in the first research question to ensure congruence. The relational dimension focuses on how does the teacher invite the student into that academic intellectual space of receiving feedback? How does that teacher grant mutual respect to that student and engage them through questioning, through instructional models, through a conversation? And finally, the pragmatic dimension. How do we know if the feedback actually works? How is the teacher champion their feedback so that students are able to take it and apply it to produce stronger, more effective writing? So this theoretical framework completely underpinned everything in this qualitative study. So my methodology was exactly that, a qualitative study. I wanted to investigate and decipher and unpack the teacher's perspectives, insights, and experiences. And so this methodology allowed me extensive access to their lived experiences. The site was a large private school in Dallas. There were 5 participants who taught primarily high school English, 9th, 10th, or 11th grade. And the data collection took the form of an initial electronic questionnaire, 5 questions that invited meaningful reflection about the teacher's feedback practices, their experience with feedback, and then the semi-structured interview was a follow-up after having read the answers to the electronic questionnaire. And this semi-structured interview allowed me to challenge perspectives, to ask clarifying questions. And during this semi-structured interview space, the participants and I also assessed some student writing artifacts from a first draft to a final draft. Here's what I uncovered from those data collection procedures. The first 2 themes align with the design dimension. Theme 3 and 4 align with the relational dimension. And finally, the 5th theme aligns with the pragmatic dimension. Number 1, a streamlined, uniform rubric is so critical when it comes to feedback. It is important that the teacher and the student have a shared form, a shared accountable form that is used to indicate to the student strengths and weaknesses. Theme 2, instructors must set aside the time and space for one-on-one conferencing. Simply handing a rubric to the student does not do any good unless the student is able to ask questions, have a conversation, be able to engage the way in which you assess the writing. Instructors attempted, in their answers, they attempted to admit that they assumed the role of a coach. However, they did struggle with this. By assuming the role of a coach, they had to remove their inherent instructional authority and try to simply question and challenge the student and not assume that everything they assessed in the student's writing was entirely perfect. Theme 4, instructors encourage students to intellectually grapple with the feedback. This came up time and time again. Feedback is hard. Understanding feedback is hard. Applying feedback can feel downright impossible, but that is critical because it is through those feedback moments that students have the capacity to grow intellectually. And finally, instructors were able to pinpoint areas in which the student improved on concrete rubric skills, such as the strength of their thesis and topic sentences, and some concrete paragraphing, such as their selection of evidence and their commentary on that evidence. All my findings really align with several key aspects of literature review. 1, it's not enough to just teach the expository form and provide feedback in the classroom. We have to move beyond the classroom, and Dockeral and Troia and Graham support this. 2, every piece of feedback that we offer students must be tightly aligned to assessment criteria. If there's not a rubric, it's not fair to believe that students are going to automatically understand that feedback. There has to be criteria every time there's feedback. And number three, we have to, as teachers, embracing a role of a coach is so critical because that encourages us to move more towards dialogue, and dialogue can help students embrace accountability in the writing process. All these findings align with the broader trajectory of the literature review, where feedback is moving from a product to a process. I have a couple key implications and recommendations, all of which you can read on the screen. The one I really want to focus on is the current and new teachers. So my recommendation at this particular school, and it could apply to other schools as well, is to develop a mentor-mentee system in which new teachers can understand how to approach feedback in conferencing and in the classroom through intensive observation with experienced teachers. They can actually observe how a teacher embraces questioning and dialogue in revision and writing conferences. The other recommendation I would mention is it is absolutely critical that teachers create a very concrete blueprint that students follow through in revision writing when they are correcting their writing. It is through these iterative stages of meeting with the teacher, receiving feedback, and attempting to improve writing where gradual improvement can transpire. In my interviews with the teacher, it was clear that when students embrace the revision writing system and they meet with the teacher frequently and they attempt to apply concrete changes to their writing, the overall academic improvement significantly increases. And that is primarily from the teacher's perspective. A couple of limitations and delimitations from my study. One, because of its qualitative nature, clearly I cannot prove causality. I cannot definitively say that the teacher's feedback definitively and incontestably contributed to stronger academic writing. I can only say that the teachers perceived the writing to have improved from their feedback. It is possible that participants might not have been as candid and direct on their answers. I only focused on the content area of English, so there is a lack of diversity among my participants, all of whom are high school English teachers. This study did not extend beyond that. And also, too, it's important to pinpoint, I did not conduct any data that incorporated student voices. While I incorporated student writing artifact, no interviews with students were conducted in the context of this study. So how would I distribute my findings? Well, one, I want to package the meaningful information I found about how important it is to be aligned on revision policies and be aligned on a system of feedback to my academic administration, to my department, and perhaps to English departments who share a similar context of the department that was used in my study. I also really would find value in developing a mentor-mentee system that pairs the new teachers with experienced teachers and possibly create a system in which I develop tutorials for new teachers and how to enter into feedback moments with their students and how to embrace the role of a coach in those feedback moments. I also want to create a presentation for students and parents. This information was very valuable for teachers, but it can also be important for students to understand how teachers believe an ideal student would commit themselves to the writing process and what that looks like. So it's important to provide a blueprint for students and parents. And then finally, I also am interested in collecting this data and presenting it at an academic conference, particularly in the field of feedback, in talking about the structuring and communication of feedback, the role that teachers play, and also the perceived influence on student writing. Thank you so much for your time and your attention, and I hope you enjoyed my problem of practice presentation.